Purnima, thanks so much for joining us this morning to talk about our Business Outlook 2021 publication. We're going to start by just looking at the year that's just passed, and 2020 has been a significant year for everybody across the early years sector. I know from our perspective as a business, 2020 got off to a very positive start. Lots of market activity, demand from buyers, some great transactions completed like the sale of Kids Allowed to Kids Planet and multiple single asset transactions. In fact, in January and February, we completed 110 transactions with an aggregate value of £153 million, which was a great start to the year. But then March came and suddenly coronavirus was in the UK. And ultimately from the 21st of March, the nursery market was significantly impacted upon, as were all the other sectors across the UK, as we went into that first national lockdown. Now, I know at that point in time, operators across the country were facing significant challenges. Do you want to just talk us through some of the things that NDNA were trying to support their membership with and support the sector as a whole with as that pandemic first arrived on the UK shores?
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you for inviting me today. And as you know, normally we would have done this in a huge hall with lots of providers and other people meeting. And I think these are the times now. And I think that's the biggest change that we all faced. But yes, I think to describe 2020 as kind of, a landmark, significant year, and unfortunately for all the negative reasons, for the sector and for everybody, for the whole community and in the whole world, really. But I think, that the biggest challenges have been to learning to live with the new way of working and the constant changing guidance and constant changing rules in terms of employment law, in terms of the government guidance coming through almost every day. And for providers to be able to cope with all that at the same time, making sure that their settings are safe and secure to reassure parents has been the biggest challenge.
I think, as you rightly say, those early days were really difficult, weren't they? That guidance was coming thick and fast, and the nursery sector being asked to stay open for the children of key workers and the frontline workers amid such a changing landscape. I know it was really, really tough. We spoke to lots of operators at the time that just were struggling to make decisions based on the information that was published, but then literally 24 hours later, new information would be published. So that was such a challenge, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I think the other biggest difficulty, and we've had this all along, is the local authority variation. And even though the government's announced and set out guidance, and of course the local authority guidance was different, the way they've dealt with funding was different, and and also the Public Health England advice locally also sometimes conflicted with the national guidance, which created an awful lot of confusion for providers at a time when they were really struggling to actually deliver that high quality care. I think it's been very, very stressful indeed for everybody. But I think, what's so fantastic about this sector is everybody had to adapt so quickly, and to put it mildly, the sector is so resilient and continues to be. And I think they've made these changes, some of the things that they would have thought that they could do this way. And all of us learned, how to use Zoom, how to use technology more. And of course, for providers, you can imagine that is 10 times harder in terms of, changing things in terms of the environment for children, and also the toys that they were using before, the outdoor play and activities. Everything had to be reviewed and revisited in the light of COVID. And of course, at a time when they were really struggling in terms of their financial sustainability, they had to pay for this themselves. And this is one of the things that we've been lobbying, as you know, for quite a long time, because the government support or the lack of it in some of these areas has been the biggest challenge for providers.
I think rightly so, funding is an ongoing issue, isn't it? There were sustainability challenges before COVID, and there will continue to be sustainability challenges post-COVID, unless the local authorities pay providers an adequate rate to deliver the care that those providers are providing ultimately. I think you mentioned there in terms of the operators that were or tried to stay open during that first lockdown. I know there were some real challenges there in terms of the information being published around furloughing and funding and how that was all worked out. So that was quite challenging at the outset. I've spoken to lots of providers that actually they stayed open because they felt they had to ethically do their bit to support the UK and support the NHS in that first lockdown. And they were running at significant financial losses at that point in time, but they just wanted to do their bit to try and help out ultimately. And I think some of these financial challenges, they have been masked, and I don't think we'll see the true impact of those really for another 12 to 18 months perhaps.
No, absolutely not. And I think, the biggest issue that they had is, like I said before, about the conflicting advice and the guidance from locally, funding was also the same issue. But equally, in terms of the furlough scheme, there have been so many changes. And I think the biggest challenge for providers is that they can't afford to furlough staff because they needed the staff to be able to deliver that quality care. So yes, the furlough scheme has been great, but it hasn't been as supportive as it should have been and could have been, because especially when they took away the furlough bonus scheme. And that didn't help providers at all, because when all children started coming in and nurseries were looking after all children, that really didn't help, because with the positive cases in staffing, that made a really big challenge for providers in terms of a staffing crisis because of the positive cases that they were having to deal with. And I think, the kind of a continuous dialogue that we have been having with the governments across all nations within the UK was really to really highlight some of these challenges to the senior officials and also to ministers, because, we were having, and we still continue to have, regular meetings with all the ministers and to really highlight this. But I think, hopefully in terms of some of the positives that, people have now learned and put things in practice in such a way that they've now done all this, but they had to do it so quickly. And that was the really biggest challenge for people. But, most of the people in the sector are risking their own lives to come to work and to look after those children and to give that reassurance to parents that their settings are as COVID safe as they can possibly make it.
I think some of the lessons that have been learned through this pandemic have necessitated changes in the way some do business. And actually that can be quite advantageous moving forward.
Absolutely. I think yes, absolutely, you're right, Courtney. There have been lessons learned by all of us. But I think the most important lesson to everybody is how that human interaction, that social interaction, how important that is. And of course, nurseries looking after very young children, social distancing is not something that they can maintain and manage. Those children still need those cuddles. Those children still need that reassurance. And those children still need that kind of, the active play and active learning environment. So that was really, really important. But equally, I think some of the way that we have done things in the past, pre-COVID, also has changed. And I think some of those things will continue. Because, for example, when we went into lockdown, we realized how important training is to earliest practitioners. And we were training, face-to-face training was one of the biggest area that we were supporting the sector with. Thousands and thousands. Last year, 30,000 practitioners were trained. So very quickly, we had to set up the virtual classroom type of training so that we can still continue to support those practitioners. Either they were on furlough or working in the setting that they could actually access that setting. But I think that variation in terms of the earliest funding, and of course in England, withdrawing that for the spring term and going back to headcount has been a massive kind of, let down for the sector. And I think, like I said, in Scotland, the government supported their providers with PPE, small grants. In Wales, there has been support. So the support that was kind of given to the nursery sector across the UK has been very different. Some are national support, like furlough scheme. But I think, this is a battle that we continue to fight with the governments about. The kind of the recognition for the sector of the hard work that they do, operating like a fourth emergency service, but most importantly, the lack of understanding from the government point of view about the business model and especially for the private and voluntary sector. So this is something that we had to really challenge the Treasury, challenge the various governments across the UK to make sure this crisis in terms of the funding didn't just come because of COVID. It existed before in terms of that lack of adequate support.
I think from a parent's perspective, though, I think one of the significant elements that I've noticed from the pandemic is that the profile of early years and the role of the practitioner and what providers have to do and deal with day in, day out has absolutely been heightened. You know, all those parents that were suddenly working from home, trying to homeschool their children and look after little ones that would normally be in nursery, I think they've all recognised just this significant work and the value of the work that early years practitioners provide. And that has to be duly recompensed by Treasury in the rate that they're awarding.
Absolutely. I think, I hope that there will be a newfound respect from parents' point of view for the earlier sector. Because I think, at a time when some parents had to work from home with older children who are off school and with younger children as well, that has been absolutely horrendous for some parents. And they were really grateful for the support the nurses have been able to give. But I think that recognition has to come right from the top, from the government level, not just kind of, plain words of thank you, but it has to go along with the financial support and the backing for the sector that early years truly deserves.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think another positive, sort of looking at what's evolved over the past 12 months is the way the sector really has pulled together. There's been so much to contend with and deal with, to see providers working with each other and NDNA working with providers as you always have done, but the support that's been there on a peer-to-peer level, because operators have had all these difficult decisions to make. And if you're an owner of a business, making some really difficult business decisions on information that's changing so quickly, the ability to reach out to NDNA and to other providers to ask, what are you doing about this? And just to use that as a sounding board, I think has been really helpful. So there's greater unity from what I'm seeing in terms of that resilience of working together with one common goal.
Absolutely. I think previously, Courtney, you remember that there was a notion that all providers don't want to share things because it's business critical and this that kind of feeling is not there, because actually at a time of crisis, what we have proven time and time again is that sector has come together and providers have helped each other, and the COVID-19 group was set up and they were helping with the guidance, setting up the guidance, and also helping each other. And that has happened a lot. And of course, we have more than 60 NDNA networks across the UK. And these networks were really coming together and discussing with the local authorities in terms of their challenges and talking to each other and supporting to each other.
Looking ahead to 2021, I think, clearly we have a significant distance to travel before we can get back to any sort of new normal, I suppose, to some degree, particularly as we're currently in the third lockdown that the UK has experienced. But clearly, to try to get back to a new normal, early years have to be, or the early years workforce clearly need to be prioritised for being recipients of the vaccine, don't they? Ultimately, there has to be that comfort to the families they're serving and the early years workforce families as well. So I know you've been doing a lot of work working with providers, lobbying. What other plans do you have to try and push the vaccine to the frontline early years sector?
Right from the beginning, we have campaigned, when the government started and when the NHS staff were being clapped, which was absolutely fantastic, and they deserve that because they continue to put their own lives at risk. We set up a campaign for early years, support early years, because it was really important to highlight the profile of early years providers and what they're doing for the community and for the parents. Then we also set up a campaign about testing, because testing and tracing has become a major issue. Even though early years was put in the priority list, sometimes providers were waiting for a long time to get a test, and of course even longer in some cases to get the result. And of course, until that result comes, staff are not able to go back to work. So that created a lot of problem. And of course now, earliest is the only sector within education that is now being asked to keep open. What that means is that earliest professionals must be prioritized for vaccination. And I think that is really crucial. And we have a debate in the Parliament, following a petition next week. And we hope that will come through and earliest staff will be prioritized for vaccination, because that's really the only way they can continue to provide that care and support families and children. And most importantly, it's not just that, because we also need the funding to be reinstated back to what it was before, not just based on headcount, because that is crucial. And then only yesterday, I had a small provider ringing me saying, Purnima, I don't know what to do. I'm losing £500 a week. That may not be a lot of money, but I only have about 20 children. And if I don't get some of them back, I'm going to be finished. And so, that's the kind of scenario that we're facing across the country. We've seen some closures already. But I think, like I said before, the sector is very resilient. And we hope that once the vaccination process is actually speeded up, and that will give a lot of reassurance to both to staff and to families, and hopefully things will start improving. But yes, through your survey, the confidence is low at the moment, but equally they are positive, because hopefully with the vaccine, and even though there are no guarantees, but that is some hope moving forward for all of us.
No, I agree. I think the challenge is that, as we said before, even looking ahead to the year ahead now, nurseries have always had different challenges around funding and sustainability, and particularly smaller nurseries like the one you referenced there, 20, a provider with just 20 children, if a proportion of those children don't return, the margin between making a surplus to keep your head above water and making a significant loss is really there. Now, it's interesting speaking to owners that I do think at the moment the picture for some is slightly distorted, because during the course of last year, we've had the furlough scheme, we've had the CBILS opportunity to have loans there. I know owners have taken out direct loans with their banks to try and see them through some challenging times. We've had the business rates holiday. We've had landlords permitting rental holidays as well. And so, there is slightly a financially distorted picture, and that might not come to full fruition until the year ahead. We've also got operational cost expenditure challenges. So speaking to owners, their greater staff expenditure, because they're having to staff bubbles and isolation, ensure that staff aren't mixing, PPE supplies. Now, that might not be masks, but it could be more aprons, fogging machines, additional cleaning products. So all these different challenges, until there's a greater sort of stabilised economic balance within each nursery, the picture could be quite distorted. And so that might create some challenges.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue here is actually, your survey has proved that, and people said it could take between 1 to 3 years for a recovery. But equally, what is also important is the unemployment has already risen to highest levels. What that means is that, parents' ability to pay for childcare will be really reduced. But equally at the same time, looking on the positive side, all the government schemes have been set up for, employment schemes and retraining. Hopefully, parents would need childcare to be able to support them while they're going through that kind of transformation and change and looking for new employment and retraining. And so, yes, I think the demand for childcare will never go away. But I think, young children need those kind of really enriching environments for them to learn and be educated. But I think it will be very, very kind of, hit and miss geographically, because like you said, in some areas, we're seeing even with this lockdown, some areas actually there are more children coming in. In some areas, the number of children coming in is very low. And that's partly because of parents' confidence and the mixed messages coming from the government in terms of the safety of children, all that. But hopefully, when the vaccination reached a certain level, those fears will be, minimised hopefully, and then we will see more children coming through. But we have a long way to go there, and this is why we need support until the sector can get back on their feet to be able to pick up all that kind of, kind of backlog of where they need to be able to break even, never mind about making any surpluses, because we're talking about sustainability here. And I think it's really important. But I think, like I said, parents really appreciate and respect now the earlier sector for everything that they have done. And we want the government to do that, but not just with the plain words, but with the adequate financial support. I think that's going to be crucial.
I think the key throughout this is the word resilient. As you said, and, not every nursery is resilient, but the sector as a whole is resilient. And I think ultimately that is what's been one of the fueling drivers behind the demand that we've seen from buyers. Even in this pandemic, the demand from buyers that are seeking to invest into the earlier sector and buy nursery business, it's increased by 140% during Q2 2020, because they can see that, childcare, high caliber, high quality childcare is so sought after by parents, and therefore those settings very much sought after by buyers. And that is, childcare will always be in high demand by parents. So that's one of the real strengths, I think, of the sector going forward, that the demand from buyers is there and strong.
I think, what we have demonstrated as a sector throughout this period and even before is that nurseries want to continue to care for children and educate them and support families. They still do this, even at this time in this current lockdown as well, where there were lots of unknowns in terms of the new strain of the virus. They still are doing that. But I think, what is the most important thing moving forward is, in terms of our own lobbying and campaigning that we have to do, is this is the time now, the government really need to review completely how they are going to fund the childcare sector moving forward. But I think, what has proven, if any, is the local variations and the way the local authorities have kind of used their own discretion. For example, the business grants that the Chancellor announced, the discretionary business grants, I have written to all 150 odd local authorities in England and to ask them to make sure that they prioritize the earlier sector, because that wasn't done before. And even the business rates relief, if you remember, only the retail sector was given that 100% rate relief at the beginning. We had to really challenge and really argue with the government and the Treasury to include the earlier sector in that. And I'm glad that they've done that. But then again, we want them to continue that from April, because Scotland have already announced they're going to continue with that, and Wales reviews coming up. So we have submitted for the business rates review in England, and I think that's something that has helped providers enormously at a time when they're really struggling to actually make the business model work. So we want that business rates to continue. And of course, with Brexit, the challenges are, of course, in terms of staffing, because there are some, I think the last survey, there are about 6% of EU staff working within the earlier sector. And of course, with the staffing crisis, they want to really know what this will impact on, EU nationals coming into UK to work in the sector. And of course, VAT is another issue. We have been lobbying at NDNA as long as I can remember for 0% VAT for childcare businesses. And we hope now that we're out of Brexit that we can make that decision ourselves, So those are really the things, that the fundamental review of the funding, because we've seen huge underspends, tax-free childcare, 1.2 billion underspends over the last 3 years. Where is that money going? And we want that to be reinvested into earliest and childcare. We've seen through our Freedom of Information request last year, we've seen 66 million of underspends in the earliest budgets within local authorities, and huge amounts of contingency. We want that to be ring-fenced totally, so that money allocated for earliest reaches for earliest and reaches the providers directly.
Just looking ahead now to 2021, it was really interesting that in our provider sentiment survey, 84% of respondents actually felt positive and they saw opportunities in the year ahead. I think having come through the turmoil of 2020 with the vaccine on the horizon, there is a degree of confidence that at some point we will get there. And with the sector profile being raised and the profile of nurseries and the important role of practitioners being raised, I think there was this feeling of optimism and confidence in that survey, which is really positive to see. We know there are challenges equally. Every sector has challenges and the funding issues have to be addressed. But it was also quite notable to see in our survey findings that actually, from a market perspective, owners can see the demand from buyers is there. We had owners responding saying that actually once they're back on an even keel during the year ahead, they could well think about buying one more nursery or two more nurseries because they're so passionate about the sector, and opportunities will arise for them to expand their businesses for their own personal development as well. It was quite interesting to see in terms of some of the survey feedback, the perception of the market that despite it having been such a challenging year, a third of our survey respondents didn't actually expect to see any movement in the prices that are likely to be achieved in the year ahead. And from a valuation perspective, it's really quite difficult, but we certainly know that during 2020, we saw businesses being sold at levels of pricing which were pretty much in keeping with pre-pandemic pricing. So the multiples of value hadn't changed. What had changed slightly for some was their operational expenditure had increased, which therefore reduced their earnings, which therefore had a slight impact on value. As you know, every year we produce our Christie and Co business price indices, and the nursery sector in particular, the demand is there from buyers, the sector's resilient, and that's why it's so attractive to investors and operators wanting to grow. But the pricing has moved forward year on year on year. So, even from, I think it was 2017, there was a 10.8% movement in price indices. Now, during 2020, on the transactions that we completed pre-lockdown one and then during the rest of the year, bearing in mind that the markets were broadly closed for 3 months, we barely saw a movement in pricing. We actually recorded 0.8% indice movement, which is very, very notional. But it's good to see that actually owners feel, or a third of those respondents and those owners, they are positive about the sector, they are positive about 2021, and many of them do have acquisition plans going into the year ahead. So that confidence is something which you must be seeing in a proportion of your members. I know not all operators are confident, but it's good to see there's an underlying current of confidence.
Absolutely. I think, it's very difficult for providers at this point in time when we're going through yet another lockdown to feel optimistic or to feel confident. But having said that, I think the resilience of the sector and the value attached to early education has really brought it to the profile now during this pandemic. I think, that's really important because, some of these providers have been operating for 20 years, 30 years. And some of them feel that if we can get through 2020, we can get through anything. But I think, moving forward, they know that the parents who have been using the nursery really value the education and care that they provide. So really what we want to see happen is all governments highlighting and really prioritizing early years, because it starts from early years. And the sector has proved throughout this period that how kind of they manage the situation with ever-changing, guidance. And even when all the support, all the kind of the coverage, all the media coverage, and all the funding, everything was targeted towards schools and very little to early years. And this is what I have been personally passionate about, supporting the sector like this, because I think it's a fantastic sector and they have done absolutely wonderful job. And they need to really feel proud of what they've done. Yes, it's been, really horrible and challenging to cope with all this, but equally, I think there should be nobody more proud than what the early sector has achieved in supporting families and children. And that will be their legacy moving forward, to really continue with their business, because the parents really do appreciate that. And we know they do, because I've received so many letters and emails from not just from providers, from parents as well, about the fantastic work NDNA is doing to supporting the sector, but equally saying, my nursery has done a wonderful job for me, so thank you, and that's really is very, very comforting and reassuring at a time like this.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think as well, I think one of the challenges is that recognition. I know, well, we've all moved on to meetings by Zoom and Teams, and that's all been very helpful. But actually, I personally, in this year ahead, let's hope in 2021, I'm looking forward to the opportunity to actually get us back together. I have to say, I've missed those opportunities for the NDNA member events, the NDNA annual awards, to recognise everyone's contribution and what they do on a daily basis.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it was so soul destroying to cancel our conference and awards last year, because that is really the biggest event for the sector and for us as well. And it was really strange, like you said, to do the awards virtually. And but I think the best thing about it all is actually being able to hug people and say well done to people.
Well, I think that's it. That's absolutely the point we'd all like to focus on. And let's hope that during 2021, there's going to come a point where we can actually all get back together again, and we can then have our conferences and have our networking and just give each other hugs and thank everyone for the hard work in the sector. And I think between now and then, let's just hope that everyone stays healthy and keeps up the great work that they've been doing, and let's hope that we'll get to that position in the not too distant future.
I think we need to celebrate the fact that we are going through still, but we will get through it. And really, the sector needs a pat on their own back to say, I've done really well here. I'm proud of it. And that's what we want to see moving forward, because that's the positivity within the sector, and that will always be there.
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
Thanks, Purnima.
Thank you, Courteney.